In a moment, you're going to see the latest World Championship game. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. The World Chess Championship has exploded into life. This was a really dramatic game. Remember, game one was drawn. It was a tense affair. But this, well, let's take a look. This time, world champion Magnus Carlsen had the white pieces and he played pawn to d4. Now the question is, would Nepo go for his favourite Grunfeld defence with black? Well, I'm not surprised that he played something more solid. You know, you could be walking into massive preparation if you play the Grunfeld, and he just played pawn to d5. So this invites Carlsen to go in for example, knight c3, and it could be a queen's gambit, could be a Ragozin, could be all kinds of things, semi-Tarrasch, Slav, lots of different options, but basically d5 is a much more solid move than the Grunfeld. But Carlsen went for g3 instead, the so-called Catalan variation. A very respectable opening indeed. Bishop e7, bishop g2, all absolutely normal, both sides castled. And now pawn takes pawn on c4, absolutely standard. Queen c2, and now the main line here is to play pawn to a6 for black. And if queen takes pawn, b5 or a4 is also another main move. But here Nepo played something a little bit unusual, but actually quite trendy at the moment. And that's pawn to b5, protecting that pawn. And here, the main move here is a4. Most people play that. And then, well, Carlsen has actually had this with black. And then, well, b4 is possible. But actually, recently, this very interesting pawn sacrifice with bishop b7 and then a6. This is actually quite popular at the moment. So I wonder if Nepo would have gone for that. But instead of a4 after b5, Carlsen played something which is known but is rather unusual, knight to e5. So this basically involves sacrificing a pawn. He's not looking to recover his pawn on the queen side straight away. And this was obviously a bit of a surprise for Nepo, who thought for, well, 9 minutes here. He doesn't have too many options. You can see that rook in the corner is threatened. You can either play knight d5 or c6. c6 played. And now, well, black would very much like this exchange to take place, because that would really free black's pieces, followed by potentially bishop b7. That's fine for black. But instead, well, Carlsen continued to pile on the pressure on the queen side, so threatening to take here. And knight d5 blocks the diagonal. Yep, that's all good stuff. Knight c3. So you can see Carlsen just building up pressure. So more pressure here. And Nepo now played a move which is probably necessary to get rid of this knight on e5, but not an attractive move to make. And he thought for over 10 minutes on this move. He thought for 10 minutes over knight d5. Thought for 10 minutes over this move. So he obviously wasn't feeling very comfortable, whereas Magnus was playing pretty quickly. He's obviously in his preparation. So Nepo had been surprised. And this is an awkward move to play. Yes, you want to drive the knight back. That's what happened. But that rather weakens black's king. Now here the machines indicate that b4 is the best move, but that is very committal. It rather breaks up the pawns and drives the knight to a nice square. Instead of that, Nepo played, I think, a very practical move actually. I think a good move, and that's queen d7. It covers that b5 pawn, but also covers the e6 pawn. It looks rather ungainly, but it does protect key squares in the position. Also covers b7 as well when the bishop arrives there. Pawn to e4, very committal from Carlsen. But he had about almost a half an hour lead on the clock here, which is significant. Remember, they're not playing with an increment until move 61. The 40 moves in 2 hours is the time control. So got to think about the clock pretty seriously. But e4 is a very committal move because it allows black's knight into this fantastic square on d3. And this is a classic example of an octopus knight, which stretches over into white's position. So fascinating that Carlsen is prepared to allow that knight deep into the heart of his position. But, well, he'd obviously... I mean, I don't know whether this is still his preparation, but he was obviously comfortable with his position. He played e5 after 15 minutes. It's a good move. So it starts to open up this diagonal again. And it's possible to play like this when there isn't a knight coming into d5, for example. And here, yeah, it's a tricky decision for black. There are, white has very interesting possibilities here to take on f6 and open up the king side. And if black tries to keep it closed like this, then it's possible to take here and even sacrifice a pawn with d5. I mean, there are lots of interesting ideas for white. It's interesting that white just kind of bypasses that knight on d3. So I think Nepo's next move I really like, actually. He plays bishop b7. It's just a very practical move. It's not the first choice of the machines, but it's still practical and not a bad move at all. Black has to think about development here. Carlsen took on f6 as a good move because it slightly weakens black's king side. Bishop takes and knight e4. So that knight coming to a very nice position, looming over into black's territory. And here, well, for example, Carlsen would love it if black took another pawn. I mean, this is so risky. Black is how many pawns up? 2 pawns up, but suddenly white's pieces look absolutely fantastic here. h7 also vulnerable. And, what is black's development? Well, on the queen side, very poor. So really, Nepomniachtchi has to be very careful in this position. I think very prudently, he just brought out his queen's knight. He has to bring his pieces over. And here Carlsen made a mistake. He overlooked Nepo's idea. Here, I mean, white has pretty good compensation for the pawn if, for example, he just takes and then plays bishop h6. And, well, white can either play b3 to start to undermine that knight or indeed play here and then after this exchange, go b3. And, well, white has a very nice compensation there. Beautiful bishops. And black's king potentially is vulnerable here. So, I mean, that's one option. You can also play bishop e3. But the move Carlsen played, very straightforward, very direct. It's a mistake. And Carlsen had simply overlooked this idea. Bishop takes knight, and then knight c5. Maybe it's because black is giving up that important dark-squared bishop that he didn't consider it seriously. But this is a good move from Nepo, who kind of frowned and sort of looked up at Magnus at this point, as if to say, this is good for me. What are you up to? So clock time started to even up now. This is 53 minutes for Carlsen remaining. Nepo had about an hour left. Now, so what's the story here? Well, if knight takes here, then actually, black has relieved a lot of the pressure. For example, after this, the bishop exchange, then that knight is going to sink itself back on d3 or possibly b3. Black is looking fine. So at this moment, Carlsen had to be very brave. He threw the knight into d6. So we've now got a double octopus position. You've got to love that. 2 octopuses in the position. And the knight on d6 is really splendid. However, knight b3 wins material for black. This is the problem. And here, actually, Carlsen made another mistake. His position isn't that bad. Well, he gave up material in one way and got some compensation, but it's better to play bishop e3 here than what he did. We'll look at the game continuation in a second. In fact, white still has pretty healthy compensation here. The knight is splendid, of course, and if, let's say, knight takes pawn, then bishop here, and, you know, there is considerable pressure in this position, you know, b5 as well, and pressure on the e file. I mean, black doesn't need to play like that, but this is actually pretty reasonable for white. But instead, Carlsen played rook b1, and he still got compensation. So he loses an exchange here, and that knight is excellent. But, well, as we'll see, Nepo gets excellent chances now. Rook b8 is a good move, obviously protecting the bishop and perhaps looking to open up the b file. And, well, at some moment he wants to play c5 as well. Let's see. So rook d1, that rook starts to menace the queen. And here Nepo started moving very, very quickly. That was always his reputation, that, you know, he moved very quickly, even in very, very complex situations such as this. He played bishop a8, but pawn takes pawn here is the best move. Now, this looks incredibly ugly to break up pawns, but basically it starts the process of exchanging, and this rook is going to come into play here. You know, sometimes to make an omelette, you've got to break some eggs, and that's the best move. And there's just one little tactic which is quite important. So, for example, here, and queen takes c4 looks quite pleasant for white, but now black liberates with pawn to c5. Now, this is a very important tactical point, because if bishop takes, rook takes, there is a pin. The knight can't take the rook because of queen takes rook check. And you can see that because of the capturing the pawn here, then the rook is on the open file looking at the pawn on b2. So pawn takes pawn would have been stronger for Nepo and gives him a very good position. Instead he played bishop a8, which is certainly not a bad move. But, well, let's see. And here Carlsen played bishop e4. Okay, that's interesting. He could have taken here, but I guess he didn't want to open up the b file. So bishop e4, so that's sending this bishop in this direction, and starts to perhaps threaten to take check and play the rook up. So at this moment, Nepo decided to play very pragmatically again and basically distracted white on the other side of the board. He could have played better. g6 seems to give black the advantage. And there's also pawn takes pawn as well. So black had options here, but c3 is a bit too much of a compromise from Nepo. And here, well, the players were trading inaccuracies. I'm not going to say blunders. The moves weren't that bad. But here Carlsen should simply take the pawn on c3. And in all likelihood, this will probably transpose to what happened in the game. Let me just show why Nepo played like this, because there is a potential threat to take here and swing the rook up the board into the attack. But here is what Nepo had obviously calculated, that now, because the b file is open, he can check and then play c5 check, and that bishop has its day. And then pawn takes, and obviously black is winning that position. So I think that was his idea. But after this, of course, white doesn't need to take on h7. In fact, queen c2 will probably transpose to the game. That's what Carlsen should do. But after c3, he played queen c2. So he's threatening this pawn, g6, and then took on c3. But in this position, and here after b takes a4, where we've transposed to that variation that I looked at a moment ago, but here Nepo should play queen g7. This is the best move, looking at this pawn on e5. And this is the point, that after f4, In fact, black gets superb counterplay on the king side with g5. Now, white has alternatives, but queen g7 definitely a better move than Nepo's b takes a4. He was playing really quickly at this point, I think trying to put a bit of pressure on Magnus, because Magnus was running a little bit short of time. But after this, actually, white's position is secure enough. So rook d8 played. Well, I mean, I think that's an indication that things aren't quite going black's way because, of course, that knight is looking pretty good on d6. Rook a1, bit of pressure here. And finally c5, so that liberates this bishop. So I think Nepo was basically playing in a very pragmatic way. He didn't want to risk sort of falling under some attack, but just wanted to for example, bring that bishop in the corner into play. Queen c4 played. Of course, you want to avoid a queen exchange. Bishop takes, knight takes. Watch out for a check here, so king h8. And that knight just plonks itself back on d6, and that shuts out the major pieces. So, yeah, they don't have that much scope when we have that beautiful octopus knight on d6. Rook b6, queen c5, and it felt as though Nepo was just content to, coordinate his pieces, but now Carlsen has a pawn and a knight for the rook, and obviously that knight is superbly placed, and things simply aren't that bad for white now. A very, very solid position. But yeah, Nepo content just to sit there solidly. King h3 from Carlsen, that's a nice improving move. Just tucking the king out of the way, making sure there can be no checks on this diagonal, and that gives white more freedom. Rook c6, pushing the queen. King g8. You can see that, Nepo really isn't playing with that much ambition now. He's just playing very solidly. c4, queen c7. Yeah, he's just kind of sitting there, maintaining coordination, of course. So 4 moves to go till the time control. Magnus had under 5 minutes. Could he make anything of this position? Well, maybe if he'd had a bit more time, or he was in a kind of must-win situation, maybe he'd have tried for a little bit more with either rook a3 or maybe king g2 and advancing the h-pawn. If you look at this with a machine, you'll see that it thinks that white has a, very, very slight advantage. But, white can still mess this up, and particularly if you're a little bit short of time. So Carlsen just played instead queen to g4, which is, of course, a very decent move, attacking here, but it allows black to simplify, which Nepo did very gladly. So now we've got a major piece endgame with equal pawns, and, you could say that because of black's slightly exposed king, a slight advantage to white, but there's nothing in it really. And now Magnus, played c5, which actually wins a symbolic pawn. Rook takes a6, so white is a pawn up, but with 3 against 2 on the king side, no pawns on the queen side, this is a very, pretty simple draw for black to hold. And, it's for black, you want to exchange queens. You can't do it straight away. You'd like to play queen c8 here to exchange queens, but here that would be a mistake. Check, and then that stops an exchange, and then black's king has to be careful. That's not so nice. But instead, Nepo plays carefully, rook f8, threatening that pawn. Oh, incidentally, just let me go back a move. If queen takes pawn, then queen e5, check, double attack, would win. So that's why you can't take it straight away. But rook f8 hits the pawn, pawn to f4, and now, of course, you can exchange queens. And rook and 3 against rook and 2 on the same side with kind of a regular position. This is very well known that black can hold the draw quite easily. So let's just go through the remaining moves. Nepo defended accurately. Carlsen Pushed on, but to no avail. King h6 is a good move, making sure that the king doesn't come in. And the rook stays nice and active. And now checks. Takes the pawn. Carlsen just tries this, but this really doesn't get anywhere. I'll just go to the end and explain why they agreed to a draw. So that attacks the pawn, and if the pawn advances, well, the pawns will just be too vulnerable then. So king f3. Well, indeed, vulnerable straight away, because the rook check would actually win the pawn. So king f3, so the rook checks, and here they agree to draw. They've repeated the position. So why didn't Carlsen protect with king g3? Well, he could have done. Let's just see what would happen. Check here, rook a4, again attacking that pawn. If rook f6, yes, if white could take here and somehow advance the pawn and move the rook away, white might be doing something, but here's the key move in this position. Pawn to h6, and that forces another pawn exchange. So after this, this really is very well known that white cannot make progress here. Rook a1, for example. And yeah, so basically after rook a4, the players agreed to a draw. Wow, a really dramatic game. Just quick recap. So a very adventurous opening from Carlsen. You know, the machines don't necessarily approve of the move knight e5, but he obviously, plotted that one carefully to get a very unbalanced position. Nice idea. He almost caught Nepo. Nepo looking very uncomfortable. But, yeah, Carlsen went wrong. This was the moment, knight a6. And he played too hastily with knight e5, but still led to a very interesting position. And there were some inaccuracies, but, well, honours were even at the end. Okay, let's look at the scores. There we go. After 2 games, we have 2 draws. 14 games will be played. Best of 14. Let's just go down, have a quick look at the match schedule. There we go. So there's going to be a game tomorrow on Sunday. And then 3 days. Remember, the 3 days are on Mondays and Thursdays. And if you want to check out some great commentary, do check out the Chess24 Oslo studio, hosted by Kaya. And if you want a deep dive into the position, then Judith Polgar and Anish Giri go into great detail. And that's absolutely fascinating to hear their views. So there we go. Really interesting day today in Dubai. And do join me for the recap of Game 3 tomorrow. Thanks for watching.